Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I love that clip. That's from the movie Apple Pushers. I want to thank you so much for coming to our Food Policy for Breakfast seminar series. I want to welcome you here to Roosevelt House, Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, our co-host for today's panel discussion. My name is Charles Platkin, and I'm the director of the Hunter College New York City Food Policy Center and a nutrition professor here at Hunter. Today, we're so honored to have several prominent and impressive guests. And, those two words, I didn't just choose them randomly. I actually spent about a half hour picking those two words because they really are impressive and prominent. Smita Narula, a distinguished lecturer and interim director of the Human Rights Program here at Roosevelt House. Alex Beecham, the Northeast Regional Director of Food and Water Watch. Margaret Brown, a staff attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, known as NRDC. Margot Pollins, a professor at Pace Law School and faculty director of the Pace NRDC Food Law Initiative. Before we get started with today's panel discussion, I would like to introduce a true human rights and food policy hero, Smita Narula, the interim director of the Human Rights Program here at Roosevelt House. Thank you.
Never been called a food policy hero before. Thank you, Charles. So good morning, everyone. My name is Smita, and as Charles has already shared, I'm the interim director of the Human Rights Program here at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. On behalf of Roosevelt House, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you here today. Our program this morning is very much in keeping with the threefold mission of Roosevelt House to educate students in public policy and human rights, to support faculty research, and to foster creative and thoughtful dialogue on issues that are at the forefront of public discourse and debate. And certainly how we ensure the health of our food and who gets access to healthy food is very much an issue that is at the forefront of our current public discourse and debate. It feels especially appropriate to be having this conversation in this particular building, which is the former home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin's mother, Sarah. I think Eleanor would surely be very pleased to see you all here at today's forum. As some of you know, Eleanor Roosevelt was a leading proponent and drafter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and was insistent on the full inclusion of social and economic rights in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Both the public policy program and the human rights programs housed here at Roosevelt House and the students enrolled therein take very seriously the idea that access to sufficient, nutritious food is a fundamental human right and that public policy plays an enormous role in ensuring that right. So without further ado, I'll welcome you all to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So if we could just have each of the panelists introduce themselves and tell us a little about your background and your connection to this topic.
Good morning. I'm Margot Pollins. I'm an associate professor at Pace Law School, where I teach food law and environmental law, and I'm also the faculty director of the Pace NRDC Food Law Initiative, and I think what I'd like to do actually is just tell you a little bit about that initiative. We started it about 3 years ago, and it's fun to be on this panel with Margaret, who was our collaborator on that project. Our mission is to expand access to legal services for farmers and food businesses with the idea that these are businesses that are trying to improve the equity and sustainability of our food system, and legal services for these businesses is a key part of the infrastructure that can make them successful, and it's really lacking, particularly for farmers in rural areas, for small startup for-profit businesses that can't afford market rate legal services and don't have access to traditional pro bono legal services. So we're really trying to fill that gap through our program. The primary component of it is a legal services clinic at the law school that provides pro bono services, but we also are working on a series of training programs, some aimed at farmers, others aimed at attorneys, to try to make sure that all of these businesses that are doing really creative and interesting work can have help navigating the really complex networks of regulations that food businesses face, food safety laws, land use laws, all of this really complicated stuff that's often really stacked against businesses trying to do creative things. And then I'll say a little bit about my own academic work because it's sort of on a different track. I research environmental regulation of food production and focusing mostly on federal level research. So it's fun to sort of take a localer step here and think about what the city is doing and how what the city is doing is affected by what our federal government is doing. And there's a real problem with our federal food regulation, and the food system is really given sort of different and special treatment than other areas of industry, and is really exempt from a lot of key environmental laws, a lot of labor laws, and there's a real need to sort of think seriously about how we can fill that gap. So it's exciting to think about what the city can do.
Hi, I'm Margaret Brown. I'm a staff attorney at NRDC. We're a national environmental and public health nonprofit headquartered here in New York City. We have 5 offices around the US and an office in Beijing, China. We work on almost every environmental issue you can think of: protecting whales from Navy sonar, suing NYCHA over mold and moisture issues in their housing, really across the gamut. And I work on food, 100% of my time focused here in New York City, on all the environmental issues addressing food, and then also on what's most important to our community around access, affordability, and food equity. And just to give an additional little plug to the PACE NRDC Food Law Initiative, I think we at NRDC primarily do policy work, and that's what we'll talk about today. But one of the things that we're most excited about the Food Law Clinic is the ability to get to some of the root causes of hunger and build wealth and entrepreneurship in low-income communities around food, which we're hopeful the clinic can do.
Great. I'm Alex Beecham. I'm the Northeast Region Director at Food and Water Watch. So Food and Water Watch is also a national environmental group. We fight for those things we can't live without: are clean, safe, affordable food and water resources. And I think the kind of through line to all of my work, or our work rather, is really fighting the corporate control and abuse of either the food system or water system, and see I think the root cause of a lot of the food problems or problems in the food system as the kind of increasing corporate consolidation of the food system, where you look at whatever sector, you're looking at fewer and fewer companies really controlling the food we eat. So that's kind of the work we do here in New York. We ran a several years long campaign for GMO labeling in New York. You might notice that doesn't exist, right? We lost that. In part, actually, because Representative Pompeo at the time passed a bill exempting states, so you can't do that at the state level. He's now our CIA director and maybe our future Secretary of State, so that's nice. So that's kind of the work we do. The only other thing I'll say about us, I think, is that we really try to focus on organizing as kind of the niche we fill in the movement. So we do policy work and lobbying and some of that stuff, but really view our place as trying to build a movement and trying to kind of organize the grassroots, because I think ultimately that's kind of where our power comes from. So.
Hello again, I'm Smitha Narula, and I just want to first start by saying how thankful I am for all the work that the other panelists are doing and the issues they represent, which I feel are incredibly important to ensuring the right to food. And my thanks to Charles and Alexina and the New York City Food Policy Center at Hunter for bringing this conversation together. The reason I'm on the panel is because I've spent many years now promoting and defending access to sufficient nutritious food as a fundamental human right around the world, and in also trying to support social movements, policy, and international law frameworks that help build food systems that are sustainable, nourishing, and just. I'm very happy and privileged to be teaching a course here at Roosevelt House to our wonderful undergraduate students called The Global Food System, Power, Policy, and Human Rights. Many of my students are in the audience today. And through that course and through my work, it's a meditation on looking at food as a means of having a conversation about power. And who has the power to have access to sufficient healthy food? How is that power wielded to whose benefit and to whose detriment? And food is also a profound way to look at different forms of structural violence in our communities and societies, whether it's on the basis of race or caste, gender, or one's indigenous status. Much of the legacy of food and how it how it either heals or harms our bodies is connected to our legacy of colonialism, slavery, and patriarchy, and now increasingly, and actually probably since the beginning, to the corporate capture of the food system to continue to push structural violence through food. Food is also a tremendous place for, I think, transformation and healing, and I think a lot of the work represented here is about the ways in which food can also be an incredible power, not just for justice, but for building new systems that are transformative and sustainable. So that's what brings me here, and I appreciate being part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. So I want to start by getting right into the sort of the theme topic, and that's New York City has been a pioneer to some degree in promoting healthy eating. The green carts was one initiative, mandatory calorie labeling. Whether you agree with these or not, there's still legislative initiatives, restaurant grading system, a ban on trans fat in restaurants, creation of a director of food policy, I think Ben Tomasi was the first one, who you saw in that clip. The FRESH program, which offers incentives and zoning programs for supermarkets to create healthy access. And all these programs sound like they can do good. But why is there such a significant pushback from politicians and or consumers on legislating these kinds of eating behavior? I mean, the concept of the nanny state and so forth, but we're not doing it well we're not really doing it well in terms of healthy eating and so forth. We've sort of accomplished it with smoking, but not with eating.
Well, it seems like a big question, right? Which is maybe why we all just looked at each other. So, I mean, from my perspective, I think New York City's done, comparably kind of an amazing job in reference to kind of the rest of the country. That said, I think there's an enormous pushback, and it's been really interesting to me as somebody who works on both food issues and a lot of energy issues, right? And so there's gigantic companies with basically unlimited budgets on both those issues, right? So like the Exxons of the world or the Monsantos of the world, these are gigantic companies. And to me, what's been really interesting to see is the food guys are just a lot smarter at the kind of public messaging. They're a lot smarter at, frankly, like kind of organizing, right? So you might look down on it and say this isn't real grassroots, but they can bring real people to hearings like the one we just saw to come and speak out in a way that the oil guys cannot. And I'm not sure how helpful this is for all of us, but to me, the kind of difference, right, is that if you're an oil company, you've almost never had to sell your product, right? So like, we just have to buy it. And food is kind of the opposite, right? Where there's all these different choices and all of it is really about marketing. And so I think that skill kind of translates and makes them much, much, much better at these public policy battles. So that's one thing. The other thing is I think our side is weaker, right? So the food movement is really interesting and bigger, I think, now than it probably has ever been. At the same time, it still remains this kind of niche thing. We're not talking about food in presidential debates. We're not talking about food at the kind of political level. And that's a real problem, and I think it ultimately takes kind of a movement to bring it there. That's been, I think, coming, and it's like fits and starts, and I think it's getting better, but it's nowhere near where the environmental movement is, and frankly, the environmental movement, we're having plenty of losses across the board, right? So I guess my sort of simple and not very helpful answer is we need more movement building, we need more organizing. And I guess the other thing I'd say about the city in particular, and even New York State, right? There is a real gap in what people are saying in rooms like this, and frankly, in boroughs like Manhattan and what's happening in the rest of the city. It's not a coincidence that it's John Liu up there from Queens. We've seen that exact dynamic play out on GMO labeling, where the exact same thing happened. We've seen the same debate play out, frankly, on plastic bags. And so that, I think, points to a real need to do deep organizing in communities of color in New York City and in the outer boroughs, which I think we're just not even close to strong enough in.
Just to that point, can we keep that discussion alive in terms of some of the granularity of what we can do, okay? Because, for instance, the GMO not having some sort of labeling requirements in New York City, or something that we can do to sort of represent the city in terms of the country, and set an example. How do we reach those people, and what can we do differently that we're not doing now? We could save that after your comment.
So I want to echo a lot of what Alex said, and I think the really simple answer to your first question is corporate power, and that's the reason why we've been unsuccessful on a lot of these issues. But to complicate that a little bit, I think one of the other things that's different between food and energy is what food means to people, and I think that it's easier for food companies to organize and to get people excited in opposition to some of these ideas because they can talk about things like food freedom and personal choice that have a lot more meaning in the food context than I think they do with oil and gas. And I think one of the most dangerous things about the food movement is the phrase "vote with your dollar." And that has been such a central part of the movement from the beginning. And it's really undermining because it suggests that we can resolve all of these problems simply through our choices as consumers. But that's really not true for lots of reasons that we can go into later in the questioning. And it is then really undermining when it comes to political fights like this because the food movement hasn't really organized around political advocacy. It's organized around consumer advocacy, and it's just not pointed in the direction to really get people focused on legislation.
Would you mind getting to that now, though? About
Okay.
yeah. It's important, and I think that the whole idea of these breakfasts is to try to stimulate thought so that we can go out and actually do something and change, and not just say that corporations are bad and food companies are bad, and really come up with strategies and ideas that are going to impact.
Okay, so here's why we can't vote with our dollars on this issue. The first reason is the lack of transparency in the food system. And a lot of the food movement has focused around increasing transparency, and that's great. But even if we have perfect transparency, I still think we can't vote with our dollars on these issues because the food system is enormously sprawling and complex. And I as someone who spends almost all of my time reading about food and trying to understand how the food system works and where it comes from, I still go to the supermarket and sort of walk around aimlessly thinking, like, I don't actually know how to buy food that's sustainable. I don't actually know how to buy food that doesn't have serious impacts for the people involved in the production process. And more importantly than either of those two things, I don't really know how to make a trade-off between those two things. I don't know how to say, well, I know that this item of food has a low carbon footprint, but maybe had bigger labor impacts, and how do I balance those things? And if I really wanted to be able to do that, I would basically have to give up the rest of my entire life and spend all of my time investigating every single food choice that I make. And that's just crazy. I mean, most people don't want to spend the time doing that. Even people who really care about it a lot can't spend the time doing that. Most people can't afford to spend the time doing that. And the idea that it should be the consumer's burden to do that, I think, is absurd. It should be the responsibility of government regulators, and it should be the responsibility of the corporations that are creating these impacts, that are creating the labor impacts, that are creating the environmental impacts. In almost every other area of industry, we have a principle called the polluter pays. So the default rule when you're regulating something is that you should put the burden for solving the problem on the person creating the problem. In the food movement, for some reason, that has not been the primary line of reasoning. We as consumers should take responsibility. Now, it is true that we as food consumers are contributing to the problem. We create the demand, we're buying the products, but we have these enormous structural barriers to being the solution. And so I think, it's not to say that the vote with your dollar hasn't had some successes and can't have some additional successes. There are definitely success stories. But as a tool for system change, it's a really weak one.
Can I just pile on a little bit?
Yeah, and just also someone to add to the what that would look like if the polluters pay model.
So I think one of the other big concerns with the vote with your dollar or sort of market-driven change approach is that only some people have dollars that really drive change in our food system. So if we focus on driving consumers to use their purchasing power to change practices, the power around change concentrates in upper middle class white consumers, moms, millennials, people with a lot of purchasing power. And so we can have a more and more fragmented and unequitable food system. Do you want to talk about polluter pays?
Sure. So it's a really challenging problem because so we have a really comprehensive, well, we used to have a really comprehensive network of federal environmental laws that were relatively well enforced. And almost every single one of them exempts agriculture in one way or another. And there's lots of historical reasons for that, and there are some practical reasons for that, although technology has made a lot of the practical reasons for that obsolete. But the position that we're in now is that for the most part, and there are some exceptions, environmental law doesn't apply to agriculture, and shifting that has been almost impossible. It's a political non-starter. I don't know, I guess it's sort of my life's work to figure out how we do that, and I have no answer yet, so I'm sorry, I can't give you the sort of what do we go do about this now. But I think the first thing that we need to do about it now is sort of get the issue on the political radar. It's important that we know about this, that we know that the Clean Water Act's requirements for getting a permit to pollute water don't apply to the vast majority of farms. So at this point in this country, the Clean Water Act has been a really successful law at cleaning up our surface water. The leading cause now of surface water contamination is agriculture. Agriculture contributes to a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that's the size of the state of Connecticut, and in some years of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. It's a really serious problem with really serious actual on-the-ground impacts for recreation, for the fishing industry, and of course for the environment itself. So I think the key for me is about shifting what the food movement is all about from being a consumer movement, a really neoliberal consumer movement, to being a political advocacy movement that's aimed at understanding the true cost of food, holding accountable those who are imposing those costs, and figuring out a sort of different way to have the conversation.
So I wanted to piggyback on some of those points. First, on the consumption point, and I very much agree the vote with your fork idea. Many of us grimaced at that, and was for the reasons already mentioned, which is that it's difficult to vote with your fork when you're economically disenfranchised, right? And but I also want to stress that us as consumers, particularly in the global north, our consumption choices actually have an enormous impact on the human rights of people all over the world and in this country, right? So as someone who has actively worked with social movements and fought to fight against large-scale land grabs all over the global south, and then land grabs from farmers of color here in the United States, a lot of that, at least in the global south, is driven by our consumption choices. You know, our demand for meat at every meal, our newfound love of quinoa, our, all of the things that we think make us sort of healthy food eaters are literally those consumption choices. We're in a global economy where our luxury demands are competing with the subsistence needs of rural populations all over the world, and entire, just millions of hectares of land are being completely deforested, grazed, and people are being displaced to grow biofuels for our energy consumption, to grow feed for livestock to satisfy our meat consumption. And so I do think we do have the power as consumers, but it's not the way that capitalism wants to exercise that power. The power is to reduce our consumption dramatically and to do it as an act of love and solidarity with people's movements all over the world. Not just to say, well, now I'm still going to consume as much as I want whenever I want, but I'm going to shift that choice somewhere else. And so that's just a consumption point. And I think on the issue of organizing, I would actually say there's a tremendous amount of organizing that's already happening. And I think the job for those of us interested in these issues, and especially those of us who come to these issues with privilege, is to show up in those conversations and ask how we can be allies to movements that are already forming, right? And I think some of the issues are that the demands of those movements are much more around socioeconomic rights. They're much more around racial and gender justice and indigenous justice issues and climate justice, away from issues of labeling, which are important, so significantly important to everybody, but they're centered on things like demanding a living wage, right? Demanding an end to land grabs in communities of color, demanding that there be access to land and productive resources, water and seed for those who are trying to go back to the land and come into the food system, and including in that migrant farmers who have engaged in a forced migration from Mexico here, or black farmers, and the extent of black land loss in this country has been to the tune of millions of acres. So I would just say one of the things I think that's fractured about the movement, but I think also has the potential to knit things together, is are we demanding the same things? And are we honoring the leadership and voices of those who are already at the forefront of these conversations, who see food as a means to address really much deeper socioeconomic, structural, and racial issues in the country and beyond, and there's so many who are involved in that. There's just one last thing I would say also, our terminology also matters here. I think the Apple Pushers film it's essentially about ensuring, I haven't seen the film, but the issue is, it seems to me, about getting access to healthful food in low-income communities, right? And we often throw around the term food desert to describe communities that don't have access to that. And I just want to carry forward some learning that I've had from Leah Penniman at Soulfire Farm and Lori Clevenger at Rise and Root Farm, who's now at Why Hunger, to even change how we use the terminology. It's not a food desert, which seems like a naturally occurring environment, but food apartheid. There is food in those communities, but it's toxic food. It's processed food, and it's meant to, and it exists in such abundance because these are often communities of color whose bodies are seen as disposable in our current global economy. And to be honest about those aspects of food deserts and who comes in, I think becomes very profound. Just that name to me, when I learned from that, I just wanted to pass that forward, because food apartheid is a very different set of conversations and brings up very different kinds of solutions, as does talking about human rights than talking about food deserts.
Thank you. That was great. They also call it food swamps now because of the, and also talking differently about the term food insecurity and hunger. And most people don't know, when we did our survey, what food insecurity means. And it's talked about frequently in academic and political environments, but those that are food insecure aren't really sure what that means. So thank you for that. And we've done some research with a report with Georgetown Law, and some of the things that came out of it were 3 components to passing sustainable food-related legislation. And I just wanted to run it by this panel and see what you think. We and see what we're missing, or if this makes sense. Legal viability, sufficient regulatory authority and evidence-based, closely tailored to public health objectives is the first component. The second is political sustainability. Strong public support, political champion, someone that's going to champion the cause, and effective and efficient implementation. And the third is public support, grassroots support, understanding of public health benefits, and public demand. So we've identified those 3 components as to why necessarily a soda tax might pass or not pass in a community, and using that as sort of a litmus test to understand what's been working and what's not. And again, it wasn't a complete science, but just sort of a peek in to see what would work and what wouldn't. And I wanted to know if you had any thoughts about those elements. Someone cut my mic. Are we missing something, or did those sound about right? And could you add anything to that? Should I repeat them quickly, or you got it?
I got them. Does the audience want them repeated? Yeah, they do.
It's legal viability, political sustainability, and public support. Those 3 components.
Okay. My first inclination is that those are dead on, but I have a slight amendment. So the first one I think is really important, legal viability, when we think about who we're going up against in these fights. So they're getting at many of these public health or environmental laws that we're seeking to pass get at the profitability of major companies. So they will attack them, and they have a lot of lawyers. So making sure that we've really tailored the law in a way that can stand up to those challenges is very important. because it both sets precedent around the country and it's an enormous time suck to get something like this passed, then have it challenged, lose it. You sometimes wouldn't even start again. For item 2, I think that that's definitely right, and we like to think of ourselves at NRDC as pragmatists, right? We don't want to work on it for a decade on something that has no chance of passing, but I think we should challenge ourselves more to let 3 lead 2. Politicians are responsive to their constituents, and we should set their priorities instead of allowing them to set ours. So the things that are driving concern in communities and the on-the-ground movements should be risen up and taken to these decision makers and allow that to inform their priorities instead of the other way around.
I mean, that makes sense to me. The only thing I'd add about maybe the third piece here, right, is when we talk about grassroots support, sometimes you think about like a polling question. Does the public support this position or that position? I think it's much more relevant to think about how much people care. So like the perfect issue is not only has broad support, but deep support. And on a lot of food issues, in the beginning, there's broad support, but it's not deep, right? So labeling, as someone who worked on it, is kind of the perfect example of this. Everybody wants labeling. No one really cares about it. And those that do really care about it.
I care about it.
Yeah. So you're the ideal activist, right? The less ideal one is the sort of crazy GMO activist who thinks it causes autism or whatever. So that's a giant problem. And then also what's on the other side of it, right? So to take it out of the kind of GMO realm, on soda taxes, on some of these other issues, the other side might not have broad support, but those that care deeply. And it's tempting, I think, to say it's just the industry's money. And for sure, that is a giant problem. There are real people that care about this stuff, right? And on something like that can be framed as an economic issue or as a tax, because it is a tax, there's going to be deep opposition on the other side. So I think that point really matters. It's not only how many people care about it, but how much they care about it.
I think related to that, I was just looking over the list again that you gave the cheat sheet in advance. The one thing I don't see on it is financial support. And I think when you're going up against Pepsi, for instance, you do actually just need to have a lot of money to be able to do that, whether it's to fund your organizing efforts or to fund the research, to be able to offer the evidence-based support for the provision that you want. You really just need the money.
Yeah, and the portion cap rule in the Bloomberg administration is an example of how the soda industry really, no pun intended, poured a ton of money into basically thwarting those efforts, even though I guess it was a combination of things. It was also the fact that it wasn't a strong understood concept. I'm still confused about it, and I wrote a paper on it. So I think that it's also about the connections, like you said, Alex, and making sure that they're deep and they're thought through and they're easy to understand. Some other things that we talked about is how the efforts of industry to thwart efforts of legislation, supporting academic research. I know there's a lot of academics in here. Be careful where you take your money from. Lobbying efforts, public messaging, and funding grassroots opposition and advertising campaigns. So those are other methods to be aware of. So I wanted to also talk about, we talked about big corporations. It looks like the federal government is not going to be supporting a lot of initiatives around, around food currently. So it would be important for local governments, municipalities, to think about ways to protect their citizens. And I'm wondering, on larger issues like GMO, something that Smita and I talked about Monsanto and the seeds and the agribusiness, and how they are basically controlling our food environment. Are there ways to locally control through legislation, through incentives, our food system? Is there a way New York City can protect us from some of these bad actors? I know that's a tough question. It was on your cheat sheet.
It was. as we still don't have an answer. It's really hard. I mean, it depends on sort of to go issue by issue, because first on many things, the city is prohibited from regulating, either because it's not granted authority by the state, as was the case with the soda, the portion control restrictions, or because it's preempted from acting either by the state or the federal government. So the cities have a lot of freedom to act until their action sort of gets the attention of the state and federal level, and then it's so easy for those other jurisdictions to step in and prevent them. Alex mentioned the plastic bag laws earlier. For anyone who's not familiar with that story, New York City passed a law that would have required any vendor to charge, was it 5 cents? 5 cents for a plastic bag, and the vendors would keep that money, and so you could still get the plastic bags. The city was involved in a whole initiative to hand out reusable bags, make them available for free, and the state stepped in and imposed a moratorium on the law for a number of not that credible reasons. But the point is not the politics of that. The point is that the state has the authority to step in and tell the city that it can't do that. So what that means is that anytime we want the city to be crafting legislation, we still need to be thinking about what's happening at the state level and what's happening at the federal level to make sure that we're crafting legislation at the city level that's going to survive any attempt by opposition to get a ban from one of those other levels of government.
Just to add to the frustration on the plastic bag piece, the reason that the city proposed and passed a plastic bag fee is that the state holds taxation power in New York. So they had already thought about what the city's authority was to address this issue, and they'd decided to use a fee instead of a tax, which has limitations, but because it was something within the city's power. So then the actual issue was just getting a sense of the political climate in Albany and how strongly people in opposition to this felt, which apparently was very strongly, to go forth with a legislative change to disallow it.
I think one of the things to think about is well, a lot of the ways that this is talked about in food movements, including all over the world, is how to democratize our food systems. And so we can also think about really local initiatives like local food policy councils, which have done a lot, even at the local and municipality level, to try to address the food system within that area. There are states that have that are starting to also think about constitutionalizing or passing legislation on the right to food sovereignty or the right to food, mimicking what countries the world over are also trying to do. But I think so I do think there's incredible things to be done locally, especially now at a moment where local actions are seen as a form of resistance, right, to the federal onslaught and the longstanding corporate capture of the food system. But one thing that I just want to point out is a statistic or a fact that I always draw a lot of pleasure from, especially when we're having these conversations about just how bad our industrial food system is, whether it's GMOs, pesticides, environmental concerns, public health concerns, the enormous economic inequities and violence that's wrought on individuals who work in the food system. That 70% of the world's, that industrial, food system, the corporate food system, feeds only 30% of the world's population, using 70% of the land and an incredible amount of resources that's also very harmful for the environment. Then there's a peasant web food system all over the world, including here in the United States, that uses only 25% of the land to feed 70% of humanity, free of the GMOs and the toxins and the pesticides and the environmental degradation that we're talking about. And these are communities that are largely majority women, indigenous, youth, pastoralist, fisher folk, and who are also the ones preserving our biodiversity and nutrition in our food. There is the issue with Monsanto, and we were talking about this, Charles and I, before, is that it is trying to expand the power of the industrial food system to start to take over more and more of that system. And so things like GMO and creating patents on seeds is a way to exert that power to disenfranchise and indebt farmers to the point that they're committing suicide all over the world. In India, a farmer commits suicide every 30 minutes, not simply because of GMOs. It's a much more complicated issue than that, but certainly that plays a role in it. And I say all of that because one of the strategies that we can think about, even here locally in New York City and the world over, is what kinds of policies and efforts can we support that help build this other food system, right? So in addition to going after labeling and trying to stop Monsanto, what are the kinds of supports that we need to be able to make this other food system grow? And that kind of policy also has to be part of the conversation. And there's incredible movements and work happening here in New York City, many of which are directly sort of supported and uplifted by the people sitting on this panel, that are very much about creating those kinds of local food systems where people have agency and control over what they grow and what they eat. You know, Ron Finley, who's a guerrilla gardener, and do you guys know Ron Finley? Look up his TED Talk. It's fantastic in LA, and he's basically like growing your own food is like printing your own money, right? And that sentiment resonates with social movements all over the world, which are also saying, you know, if you have access to land and you can grow your own food in community with others, then you have freedom. That's where the freedom comes from. And those policies, including ensuring greater access to land lots and spaces to individuals to grow their food, then has to be part of the conversation as well. And I'll just mention, even as we talk about the power of corporations and their consolidation, and this is also something you can take action on. Europe has actually been very successful, and India has been, well, we'll see how successful it is, at pushing it back against some of the consolidation, at insisting on GMO labeling, a lot because of the social movements there. Indian social movements are fighting and winning against Monsanto right now. I'm going to say that optimistically because then it'll happen. But also to say, as big as those are, I also just want to remind people that the single largest social movement in the world is Via Campesina, and it's made up of peasants, fisher folk, pastoralists, indigenous peoples, youth, led and also centers the leadership of women who all around the world are pushing up against our corporate food system, neoliberalism, and the destruction of the peasantry and protecting our biodiversity. So the corporations have power, but the people power is also extremely, extremely strong. And so that's another group to go ahead and support in any way that you can.
Can I say one
sure,
more thing? Smita just reminded me I want to be a little bit more of an optimist. So I want to, there are some areas where cities have more power than others, and I think that those are worth sort of identifying and focusing on, to come back to Charles's original question. And one of them, and this is a plug for some great work that Margaret has been doing, is on the issue of procurement. So cities feed a lot of people through their schools, through prisons, through hospitals, and this is an area where cities have much more power than in other kinds of legislation, and can really shape what kind of foods people have access to, what kinds of foods people are eating. Margaret and the NRDC have been doing lots of really great work on New York City school food procurement and school food procurement around the country. Another area where cities have more inherent power is on land use. And cities control, to a large extent, what you can do with land where, and that means, can you grow tomatoes on your balcony? Can you what can you use a vacant lot for? Can you have chickens? Can you have beehives? All of that stuff is really sort of squarely within the traditional power of cities, and is an area where cities can really influence what foods people can produce themselves and can access.
So I think that's an important shift to thinking about. I think sometimes when we think of legislating better health through food policy, many of us turn toward what we can control or rule or legislate. I guess not negatively, but to control, as opposed to incentivize. And so I want to talk about that. Are we better off focusing on incentives? Tax breaks, zoning, things like that, than trying to, ban 16-ounce sodas? Is that a better use of time? I mean, you guys have all been in the battlefield, so what do you think?
I mean, it might be more politically viable, right? I think if you're just trying to change behavior, right, there's pretty good evidence that the stick is better than the carrot, right? Just not setting aside whether or not you can pass it, but if your goal is just to stop drinking soda, for instance, I mean, there's a reason there's a bag fee, right? Instead of like adding 5 cents the other way, because when you do that, it doesn't work on the plastic bag issue, for instance. So that said, though, I think maybe the bigger point here, and to your point earlier, I think that as you think of really local, maybe the reason we were struggling earlier to think about what the city can do is if you think about what we tried to do at the state and try to go to the city, that doesn't really work, right? And the more local you go, the more that's the case. So I think the solutions have to be sort of lifted up from the communities themselves, right? And that's particularly the case of this kind of hyper local organizing, right? Where if you're talking about the neighborhood food council, for instance, or the neighborhood group, you can't come in and say, well, you guys should work on X, right? It really has to be based on the community's own needs. And I think in the city, as there's less and less opportunity to make progress at the federal level or at the state level, we ought not to say, okay, let's do the same thing, but at the local level, the concerns are different locally, and the campaigns will play out much better if the demands are driven from the local community and sort of lifted up rather than sort of top down. And I think certainly, the Bloomberg administration had some real successes, but it was a very kind of top-down thing of like, let's do X. And that's part of the reason there wasn't support, right? Is I don't know that they really went out and talked to everybody and said, well, what should we do? There are pluses and minuses to both approach, right? And some of that stuff worked. So I don't mean it as necessarily a criticism, but I think going forward, to me, it's much more interesting and probably more effective to do the reverse, right? To start from the grassroots and go up.
I think also, Alex, that point makes me, when you're saying that, it made me think, a lot of it is about getting out of the way, right? Because there's already so many incredible strategies and resilience happening from the bottom up, but then the regulations come in and put a screeching halt to any of that kind of organizing or strategies, or how people are using their land, what people are doing to create community food systems, to create the networks between different systems to sort of uplift communities. But I also, at the same time, I also think part of what, thinking back now to the right to food, which is everyone has a right to food that is accessible physically and economically, adequate in terms of nutrition, available not just through markets, but also through access to land, water, seed, et cetera, and also food that's sustainably produced. That's the right, under the right to food. And the UN Special Rapporteur, on the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, on whose advisory committee I served for 6 years, one of the things that he really promoted in that time was to talk to countries about thinking holistically about food, right? So food is this, what affects our food systems, what we eat, and who has access to what we eat, or access to healthy food is actually affects an enormous interconnected web of policies. And one of the things that's been recommended by human rights experts is to have national framework laws on food, something that's happening more and more in South America as one example, that connects the dots between our agricultural policies to our minimum wage policies, to our health and education policies, and then to our regulation, labeling, et cetera, and to see those knit together as a whole, and our environmental policies as things that are affecting. So my answer would be, it's not necessarily an either or, but can we be more holistic? Although on the soda tax in particular, and I'm not an expert on it, but there is something very top down and pejorative and control, sort of patronizing of saying, if I tax this, then this is going to fix the problem of obesity and health, as opposed to, how about I pass a living wage so people can actually have access to healthful food? And why is it that soda is so much cheaper anyway than a salad, right? So why is it that the food that's bad for us is cheaper anyway? And that has a lot to do with subsidies and the Farm Bill and corporate control over the Farm Bill and other things, but it doesn't get to structural issues. And it doesn't give people agency in the choices that they make. So I think any kind of policy or intervention has to think structurally, and it has to think about, as you said, kind of uplifting the communities that are most pushed to the margins in our food system.
So just quickly, just when I hear all this, my neck starts to tense up, because I just think I feel overwhelmed, and I think, how is this ever going to happen? And that's why I think things like the portion tax, cap rule comes into effect, because, politicians think, well, this is the best we can do. So, sorry.
Well, so I just wanted to say something about the Farm Bill, which Smita mentioned in passing, because we're here talking about local food policy and what can the city do, and on a lot of these issues at this moment in time, the federal government is not a strong ally on these issues, but the Farm Bill is an important piece of federal legislation that will continue to happen regardless of who is in power in Congress and in the White House. And it's really, really, really important. So can I just get a show of hands? How many people know what the Farm Bill is? Okay, awesome. I don't need to give my what is the Farm Bill and why is it so important.
No, but do
spiel,
that.
Okay. So the Farm Bill is omnibus legislation has been passed every 5 to 7 years since the mid-1930s. That is the primary piece of federal legislation that governs agricultural subsidies and that governs federal nutrition assistance. The biggest dollar item in the Farm Bill is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is an $80 billion program, and is about 80% of Farm Bill spending. But there's also a lot of other stuff in the Farm Bill that gets at a lot of the issues that we've been talking about, and it's the smaller dollar stuff, and it's the stuff that's often at risk of sort of being on the chopping block when the Farm Bill budget is cut. But it's things like grant programs, the Farmers Market Promotion Program, the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program, the Farm to School Initiative. There are all of these programs in the Farm Bill that support building up the kinds of alternative food systems that we've been talking about, and it's mostly doing that through incentives, through grant supports, it is. The way that I like to think about it is if we care about scale in the food system, we have on the one hand antitrust law that doesn't really do a particularly good job affecting the stuff at the big end. It's at the very outside, it will check some of the bigger mergers between large corporations, but it's not a serious threat. But then we have on the other side a set of these federal initiatives that are supporting the development of diversity and scale by supporting new small businesses, by supporting building up the infrastructure for regional food systems, for markets for regional food systems. So doing things like giving grants to farmers to do value-added production and for marketing those products. One of the biggest barriers, by the way, if you're, say, a conventional soybean farmer and you want to start having a sort of mixed production organic vegetable farm and make jam, is where do you then sell that stuff? Because you're in a place where there's a whole infrastructure that's been developed around everybody growing soybeans, and you don't have another market available to you. So a lot of these smaller dollar Farm Bill programs are actually supporting developing those markets. And so I want to talk about the Farm Bill here because even though I think it's great that the city is doing a lot of taking a lot of initiative here, I don't think that means we should be sort of turning our backs and ignoring what the federal government is doing. And the Farm Bill is actually currently in a reauthorization process. The Ag committees, both the Senate and the House, are working on their drafts right now. The negotiations have apparently stalled over a sort of fight about funding levels for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. But the Farm Bill expires in October, and that means that if there's not a new Farm Bill by October, a lot of these smaller dollar programs may lose their funding. A lot of the Farm Bill initiatives that are the things we really should be championing and caring about are at risk. This happened, the last Farm Bill was passed in 2014, but the previous Farm Bill had expired in 2012. So there was a 2-year gap where Congress was passing continuing resolutions and things were sort of straggling along, and a lot of these programs were orphaned in that time. We really want to make sure that doesn't happen again. And this is a really concrete thing that everyone can go home and do, which is call your senator and your congressman and really make your voice heard on what you want in the Farm Bill. And if I could just do a little plug, the PACE Food Law Program is part of a consortium of law schools called the Farm Bill law enterprise that is doing some advocacy around the Farm Bill, and at the end of the month is publishing a series of reports that offer some sort of synthesis on what's in the Farm Bill and some advocacy goals for this next Farm Bill. And the website is farmbilllaw.org. I think, farmbilllaw.org, and there's a ton of resources on there if you want to understand more about how the Farm Bill works. So that's one place where we really do need to be paying attention still to what the federal government is doing.
And if you do call your representative, ask them not to cut SNAP or impose work requirements.
Yes.
Or
Yeah, maybe you can
otherwise.
provide us with, you send us a cheat sheet and we'll send it out.
Okay.
What to call, because it's something we could actually all do.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. We're going to go to, have some questions from the audience. Question?
First of all, it's just great to sit in the audience and hear really smart people talk about this so eloquently. As a linguist, I just love how facile you all are with this language. A comment and a question. I'm old enough to have been at the first Earth Day, and I taught environmental studies for 30 years. And I would just offer that that's a 50-year-old movement. And I think the food movement, if we call it that, is not nearly that old. And one of the key things we've seen as we studied public perceptions and understanding, and then ultimately environmental literacy over 50 years, is it takes time. And what also happened was we had a very friendly media that covered more than what gets covered today, which is obesity. It's the only thing the media in the last 15 to 20 years has covered in the United States. And that became an old story to most consumers a long time ago, and yet they still batter it. In the environmental movement, we had, by 1976, you had Love Canal. By 1983, you had Gorsuch, and we had all of these things that kept the media telling a very powerful narrative and advancing the public's environmental literacy. We don't have that comparable now. So that's my comment. If we can go back to what happened in that movement, I think we can learn some things about what needs to happen and perhaps figure out how to get these things done. My second is a question, and I know this is about getting to our point by food policy, but I would like to hear your ideas about what beside policy about food needs to happen. Because if we take the model of corporate power, country power, and bring it down to the micro level, whether it's family or community power, empowerment. The thing we learned in the environmental movement and what we learned in developmental studies over the last 100 years is that the more literate a tribe or a community becomes, the more they eat well, the more they are economically sufficient. And yet we don't see any discussion of a literacy policy. 20 to 30% of the adults in the United States can adequately read a food label. And yet we still talk about these very food-specific policies. I'd like to hear what policies besides food. I honor food as much as I can, but as a sociolinguist, I see the issue usually not starting with food. For example, a new study just came out yesterday. There's a comorbid condition. If you have violence in the home, you have much poorer eating behaviors. Instead of the food people focusing on the domestic violence, they opt for the food desert. I'd like to hear your thoughts about moving out of the food silo into what we've known about humans organizing and empowerment for the last 50 years.
That's a great question. I was thinking when we were talking about what New York City can do, what are the sort of positive things that we can do, that to me is the answer, is how can New York City be more livable for people? Can we have good paying jobs and affordable housing that give people the space and time to afford food, buy food, eat it with their families? And it's a hard issue. We, for a long time at NRDC, would have these conversations every 6 months where we should be like, maybe all 600 of us should do campaign finance reform. Maybe we should stop working on the environment. So we all love food, I think, and we see it as an issue people connect with and a way to make progress, but there are these other issues that tie so deeply to it, and I think it's one of the reasons to begin building a broader movement of all those folks to push for change.
I would just piggyback on that to say, as I really appreciated your comment, and also bringing the lessons of movement building. And to me, the environmental movement should not be a separate movement from the food movement, right? And that's also, for me, the power of food is that it connects and ties so many of these issues, and it's a lens. It's a lens to look at systems change. And a lot of what we're getting at when we're talking about food issues, when we're talking about white supremacy, when we're talking about corporate capture and neoliberalism, when we're talking about the environment, we're talking about a critique and a fundamental rebuke of the systems, the dominant systems in which we live, that have been fundamentally incompatible with life on the planet, right? And much more devastating to some lives than others. And I think that, when Charles was talking about, and I can understand that sentiment of it's the pain in the neck, saying that it's too much, right? It's too much. How are we going to do all of this? I think it's precisely what we're being called upon to do right now. We're in a moment, we could be having this conversation about education. We could be having this conversation about violence, safety, and gun control. We could be having this conversation about mass incarceration. We could be having it about Me Too, which we are going to be having this evening, or labor rights, pollution, environment, corporate capture, campaign finance. All of it, to me, seems to get at the heart of something that people are really fighting for, which is fundamental transformative systems change, not tweaks and reforms to try to put Band-Aids over things or try to make something a little bit more sustainable, appetizing, or equitable, but fundamentally disrupting the design of our systems, including our food systems. So for me, it is a lot. But then you have to choice to make of where do you put your energy. And for me, it's about putting your energy into people and movements that are leading the way by being transformative, who have been on the margins and who know resilience and have deep-seated literacy and knowledge of the earth and connection to the earth, and to value and elevate that knowledge over technocrats and other kinds of knowledge. And it's about pushing ourselves, if we have to push somewhere, to systems change. And I think that's the choice that I'm making. I think that's a choice that many people are increasingly making, because that lets you see how everything is connected, and it also says that we cannot change anything until we change everything, and I think that's the work to be done. And I don't think it's easy, but I'll go back to what I said in the beginning, which is food is where so much healing and transformation is happening. The examples that I mentioned, Soul Fire Farm, Rise and Root Farm, the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. Just a big shout out to Malik Yakini, who is trying to create a food commons in devastated low-income neighborhoods with predominantly communities of color to erase food apartheid there, and he needs support, so please support that. But there's the most interesting work that's happening, and the most compelling work that's happening is happening through food. But we all have to kind of roll our sleeves and take part, and it's not meant to be easy, because the task in front of us is enormous, but I think the rewards are enormous as well.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is very quick. I think yesterday in the New York Times there was an article about calling for a carbon tax on beef. I was wondering if any of you have read that in your comments about the viability of that happening. And the second is I work advocating for healthy meals in New York City schools. And one of the problems I see is the message coming from the children and their families. And when you ask kids what they want and what their choices would be, they say, I want cheeseburger and fries. And I think a big component of this is addressing the message and education, marketing to children, all of the cereal boxes with all the cartoon characters. And we saw some success. Someone brought up smoking. We saw success when we cut advertising to children for smoking. And what about addressing, legislating, reducing the message that's going to children on unhealthy food, like Dora the Explorer candy and things like that? Thank you.
Great questions.
I mean, on the last point, we should do that, right? I think politically it'll be hard to do, but we should, and you're totally right that the smoking example applies here. We ought not to be marketing to children on any of this stuff. And policy-wise would be pretty easy to do. Politically, I think it'd be very difficult to do, at least in the current climate, but God willing, we won't always have the current climate. I'm very skeptical of a carbon tax on beef. I mean, I don't want to open a whole can of worms here. We're one of the only groups that don't want a carbon tax on carbon, so let's let's set that aside. And we could have that debate another time. It'd be very fun. But more interestingly, setting that stuff aside and the kind of obsession with market-based solutions, we can't pass a soda tax. I think that everyone eats beef. Not everyone, obviously. Many in this room probably don't. But if we can't do it with soda, I think it's going to be really, really, really difficult to do with beef. And I'm not sure how high you'd have to set the tax is the other problem, right? So if the goal is actually behavior change, I think a whole lot of people would pay some nominal fee, which might be the case with soda as well, but certainly I think would be the case with beef. So I'm very skeptical of it. I think there's a ton of other things you could do to address the kind of systematic problems in the food industry and beef in particular. So I don't know. That's my 2 cents.
We have time for one more quick question.
Thank you. Going slightly off topic, thank you so much for pointing out Soulfire Farm and Rise Root and Yakini. Appreciate that. My question is, with neighborhoods, the type of advocacy that you should sort of promote. I mean, if we're not going to ask poor people to vote for their dollars because their dollars don't matter that much, we're not going to ask them to take a course in legislative advocacy because I've tried it. It's very, very difficult. What should we ask neighborhoods to focus on? What should their goals, I have a lot of ideas. What should education look like? What should skill sharing look like? I mean, I live in Brooklyn, living in mainly urban areas where there's not a lot of access to the land. What should a movement around food systems look like in neighborhoods?
Thank you.
I mean, I think that's the $1 million question, but I think it just has to start with talking to people and talking to people about what kinds of food are they eating and where are they getting their food from and what would they want and what are the barriers that they face on a daily basis. And I think using those kinds of conversations to then generate advocacy projects that really focus on meeting people's needs is I think actually the environmental movement is an interesting comparison point for the food movement because in many ways the environmental movement was extraordinarily successful, certainly from the measure of passing federal legislation. But one of the biggest failures of the environmental movement is that it didn't do what it just said. The environmental movement has been not that successful as framing itself as a movement about people and about health and about communities. It is often critiqued as being elitist and being a movement about wilderness and all of these sort of places that most people don't have access to and experiences that most people aren't going to have. And the fact of the matter is that environmental issues are critical to everybody in lots of really meaningful ways, and the environmental movement has not always been successful at focusing on that. And I think the food movement can learn from that mistake, and the food movement can do it better.
I also just, I think part of it is changing the narrative and flipping the question. And as opposed to saying, what are we going to ask communities to do, you can go in and say, what are they asking of us, right? Because the examples of Soulfire Farm and Rising Root Farm and the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and so many others around the country, you can throw in there the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is along with Fight for 15, two food-related movements that are the strongest labor movements in the country, right? And if you, but the question is, the demand is for the question to be flipped on its head, to go, if you're going to go into neighborhoods, to listen, to be humble, to be an ally, to listen to what is needed from those who know the solutions to the problems that are facing them and need allies, and also allies who are going to hold themselves accountable to the promises that they then make to that community and step down instead of step aside and allow that leadership to flourish, right? That's the message coming from communities. And that's why, coming back to the opening comments, that's why I like talking about food in a rights perspective, because it changes, it flips the script on the whole conversation. It's not how do we feed the world, which is a very pejorative thing to, but how do we support the capacity of communities and individuals to feed themselves? And how do we, quite frankly, ensure that they keep feeding us? All the people that we're talking about who are most disenfranchised, who are most marginalized, who are most economically exploited, who are on these lands working small plots of land to protect biodiversity and feed 70% of humanity, they're feeding us. You know, it's not the other way around. And I think flipping the script in our head a little bit and investing time listening to community members who are already doing the amazing, transformative, radical work, ask them what they need from us, and then let's hold ourselves accountable to what they ask of us.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. Alex, Margot, I appreciate it. I'd also like to thank all the staff at the center and Roosevelt House for making today's event such a success. I mean, just look around this beautiful place. It really is just stunning. Please make sure to check out nycfoodpolicy.org. Make sure to sign up for our weekly news digest that we put out each week, which has original articles, and it's a full digest of wonderful things that you should be focusing on in the food area. Our next Food Policy for Breakfast event will be back in East Harlem on April 17th, and it's going to focus on food and media, featuring Allison Aubrey, the food reporter for NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered. She has a great voice. Thanks, and I'll see you next month.